The hospital room was completely silent when the billing administrator handed me the receipt. The balance was exactly zero. My father had spent the last 40 years of his life breathing life back into rusted-out cars and abandoned transport vans. His hands were permanently scarred from endless vehicle restorations, a quiet man who built a humble life fixing things that other people threw away. When his heart suddenly failed last month, he ended up in a hospital bed that he couldn't fix with a wrench. The medical bills were supposed to absolutely bankrupt us. The total was over $150,000. I had already drafted the paperwork to sell his beloved garage just to keep him alive. But the stamped paper trembling in my hand said paid in full. The name on the cashier's check was Arthur Vance. I had never heard that name in my entire 30 years of existence. When I asked my father about it, his heart monitor instantly spiked, and he completely refused to look me in the eye. That was my first warning. I drove back to my father's empty garage that night, my mind racing. I pulled up the exterior security camera footage from the past 6 months, searching for anyone matching the description the hospital clerk had given me. At 2:14 a.m. on the recording from 3 weeks ago, I found him. A tall man in a dark gray suit, standing across the street in the freezing rain. He wasn't just watching our family business. He was holding a photograph of my mother, who had been dead for 20 years. I paused the security footage, my chest tightening. My mother had died in a tragic, but completely ordinary highway accident when I was 10. At least, that was the story my father had repeated to me for 2 decades. I left the computer and walked down to the main shop floor of Next Revival, the restoration garage my dad had built from nothing. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of motor oil and old leather, but tonight, the shadows felt oppressive. I walked into his cramped back office and started tearing apart his filing cabinets. If this stranger, Arthur Vance, was connected to my mother, the answer had to be here. Behind a stack of faded invoice ledgers from the late 90s, I found a small steel lockbox hidden beneath the floorboards. I grabbed a pry bar from the main workbench and forced the rusted hinge open. Inside wasn't emergency cash or business contracts. It was a stack of letters. And a second birth certificate. I unfolded the fragile, yellowed paper, tracing the faded ink. It was my mother's first name, but the maiden name wasn't the one she used when she married my dad. And under the section for a previous marriage, the line wasn't blank. She had been legally married to Arthur Vance. Just as the paper slipped from my trembling hands, my phone loudly buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number. I answered it in total silence. "I see you finally found the box," a deep, quiet voice said. "Now leave the garage immediately, before they realize you're in there." I froze, the phone pressed tightly against my ear. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "The man trying to keep you alive," Arthur replied, his tone chillingly calm. "Look at camera 4. Right now." I lunged toward the glowing security monitor. 2 black SUVs had just boxed in my truck in the alleyway. 4 men were stepping out, and they weren't carrying clipboards. They were holding heavy steel bolt cutters. My chest tightened. I shoved the fragile letters and the birth certificate into my jacket, killed the office lights, and slipped out the rear emergency exit just as the front rolling gate violently rattled. I spent the rest of the night in a cheap roadside motel, my hands trembling as I finally read the letters under a flickering lamp. They weren't love letters. They were frantic, terrified warnings. 20 years ago, my mother hadn't died in a random highway accident. She had been running for her life. The letters detailed a massive offshore financial fraud, a shadow corporation moving millions, and a desperate plea from my mother to Arthur, begging him to protect me. But the most sickening revelation was the signature on the smuggled financial documents she had hidden as proof. It was my father's signature. The man who had raised me, the humble mechanic with the scarred hands, wasn't a victim. He was the architect of the very crime my mother was preparing to expose. My entire existence was built on a calculated, 20-year lie. I needed to confront him immediately. But when I called the hospital at dawn, the head nurse's voice dropped into a nervous whisper. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your father checked himself out against medical advice an hour ago. He left a message for you." I gripped the phone. What did it say? He said, Tell her I'm sorry she found the box. And tell her not to trust Arthur." The line went dead. I turned around to grab my keys and flee the motel, only to find a tall man in a dark gray suit already standing inside my locked room. "I didn't break in," Arthur said, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. He tossed a silver master key onto the faded bedspread. "I bought this motel 10 years ago just to make sure you always had a safe place to run to." He stepped fully into the harsh overhead light, and the breath caught in my throat. The resemblance was undeniable. The same sharp jawline. The exact same eyes staring back at me in the mirror every morning. "He's not your father," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with 2 decades of buried grief. "I am." The room spun. My entire life hadn't been a family. It had been a hostage situation. The man I had worshipped, the humble mechanic whose hospital bills I had wept over, had stolen me after silencing my mother to protect his hidden financial empire. Arthur pulled a thick, black leather drive from his jacket. "This contains the real offshore transaction history. The digital footprint she died trying to get to me." I stared at the drive. This wasn't just evidence. It was absolute leverage. "He's running," Arthur warned. "He knows you found the lockbox. He'll empty the remaining untraceable accounts and vanish before noon." Suddenly, my phone violently vibrated. A tracking alert flashed on my screen. The little delivery truck icon, facing left on the map, indicated a massive overnight freight shipment had just arrived at the garage. A shipment I never authorized. A cold, fierce clarity washed over me. I wasn't the scared daughter of a broken mechanic anymore. "No, he's not running," I said, my voice completely steady. "He's going back to Next Revival right now to retrieve the one thing he couldn't take in the ambulance." I grabbed the drive, the fear completely gone, replaced by a burning, absolute demand for justice. "Come on," I told my real father as I opened the door. "It's time to close his shop for good." We arrived at the garage just as the heavy metal bay doors were sliding shut. I didn't hesitate. I kicked the side entry door open, stepping onto the oil-stained concrete I had known my entire life. He was frantically tearing apart the floorboards in the back office, his plastic hospital bracelet still tightly wrapped around his wrist. When he looked up, the terrified gasp that escaped his pale lips wasn't because he saw me. It was because of Arthur standing directly behind me. "It's over," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the silent shop. I held up the black leather drive. Everything she died trying to protect. Every hidden account. Every stolen dollar. It's all right here. For a split second, the man I had called Dad for 20 years looked like he was going to fight. His permanently scarred hands clenched into fists. But then, the blinding red and blue lights of local law enforcement suddenly illuminated the frosted garage windows. Arthur hadn't just brought the key to a motel. He had brought a federal financial fraud task force that had been waiting 2 decades for this exact proof. The power shifted instantly. The fake mechanic collapsed into his office chair, his shoulders slumping in absolute defeat. He finally realized he was trapped in the very prison he had built for us. I didn't stay to watch them put the handcuffs on him. I didn't need to. 6 months later, the garage was sold, the accounts were seized, and the truth was entirely public. I stood on the porch of Arthur's coastal home, watching the sunset paint the horizon. I had lost the man I thought was my father, but I had gained my actual family, my freedom, and my absolute peace. I looked down at the old, faded photograph of my mother in my hands. She could finally rest. We had won.